Yeah, well, it must be noted as we move into a global economy that there are a lot of parts of the world where Americans conduct business that don't actually share the same cultural beliefs and attitudes, nor do they share the same ethical standards. So in an international company, we have to face the question, when in Rome, should we do as the Romans do? When the norms of our home culture find themselves in conflict with those of the host nation, the multinational firm basically has four options. First, we can follow the norms of the home country. In other words, be patriotic. We are, after all, Americans. We are, regardless of where we are in the world doing business, we should follow the American standards. Secondly, follow the norms of the host country. In other words, be diplomatic. Say, even though we are an American firm, here we are in China, in South Africa, in Brazil, wherever it is, and let's follow their cultural norms out of an act of diplomacy. Thirdly, follow whichever norms are most profitable. Be expedient. Right, this seems to be the one I think most people would tend to follow because their concern is more with making money than it is with necessarily what's morally right. If I can make more money using American morality, then that's what I'm going to do. And if I can make more money using Russian morality, then that's what I'm going to do. I'll use whatever brings me the most profit. The fourth option, follow whichever norms are morally best. Now, these four possibilities are not mutually exclusive, but if we take option 4, it requires an appeal to an international moral norm for business practices. And the philosopher Norman Bowie, B-O-W-I-E, Norman Bowie is going to argue in favor of this option, saying that what we really need is to establish an international code of business ethics, and that to some degree we already have a universal standard of ethics already in play. You see, we talked back in the beginning of the course about the idea of a subjective versus an objective approach. And if you embrace the idea that morality is subjective, that it really does change and alter from one place to another, then you're left with this question of, well, should I be patriotic or diplomatic or what have you? But if you perceive a more objective standpoint, that there are certain moral standards that are absolute, that are universal, then option 4 seems to be the one that you would want to take. And of course, as an individual working for an international firm, working in a foreign country, this is a decision that you ultimately are going to have to make for yourself. Now, within Bowie's article, which I have not given you to read, I'm just kind of talking about it here, the belief that he's getting to here leads us into a discussion of cultural and moral relativism. So I wanted to give you these terms. Cultural relativism is a descriptive claim that ethical practices differ amongst cultures, that as a matter of fact, what is considered right in one culture may be considered wrong in another. Moral relativism is the claim that what is really right or wrong is what the culture says is right or wrong. So basically, they look a lot alike. The difference is that cultural relativism, as it says, is a descriptive claim. It's not actually saying this is the way it is, it's just explaining the theory. Whereas moral relativism is saying, yes, this is actually the way it is. Each culture determines for itself what is right and wrong within that culture. Well, again, if you embrace that idea of moral relativism, then you would be open to the idea of one of those earlier options. But Bowie does not. Bowie argues against both cultural and moral relativism, claiming that the differences that exist amongst the cultures on ethical behavior may not actually reflect genuine disagreement about the underlying principles of ethics. The underlying principles might be the same, but only the application of those is different. Remember a few weeks back we talked about producing medicine. And I said that, if you wanted to take a drug from the developmental stages to being able to put it on the market for sale in this country, it could take you as much as 15 years. But in Mexico, that same drug could be on the market within 6 months. It's not, according to Bowie, that there is a fundamental moral difference. The difference is just within interpretation. Both places want the same thing. They both want a product that's going to sell and make money for the company. They both want a product that's going to be an effective treatment to help the individuals of their country. The difference is in terms of how they choose to go about doing that. The Americans want to find out every possible thing they can about that drug, every possible side effect, every possible anything, before they allow it onto the market. Even if it only affects 0.25% of the population, they want to know about it. But the Mexicans would argue that, while we're worrying about that 0.25%, the 99+% of the people who could benefit from this are continuing to suffer. So doesn't it make more sense to get the product to them now? And then we'll find out about those things as time goes on. Consider another example. Bowie says that every culture condemns acts like torture. So when China was accused of human rights violation, the response wasn't cultural relativism. China's officials didn't say, well, you find these things wrong, we don't. Instead, they denied that these events ever took place. So Bowie says that that is clear evidence that every culture can be held to a universal ethical standard. Not everyone chooses to follow the rules, but they all understand what they are. Every culture knows that it's wrong to kill innocents, to torture innocents. But that doesn't stop many countries from doing it. So it's not a matter of cultural relativism. That's lazy talk in his view. We need to follow that higher moral standard at all times. The next article I want to talk about briefly is Daryl Cohn's What Can Eastern Philosophy Teach Us About Business Ethics? And in this article, Cohn believes that there are significant differences between East and West, and he uses the idea of relationships as a guide. The making of relationships and associations is something that's taken very seriously in Asia. And this is an idea that goes back to Confucius, which is why I gave you the video on Confucius that I'd asked you to look at. Remember that everyone in the world, according to Confucianism, is owed basic respect. But there are levels, right? And achieving a high level of respect is something that's very difficult. Cohn says that trusting others is nothing other than living and acting within a social matrix. So businesses should understand themselves as striving to be true to the trust that they employ simply by virtue of being a human institution operating within a social matrix. When we form a new relationship, that relationship is for life. It's not something that should be taken lightly. In the West, friendship is a relationship that's frequently abused. We might form a friendship for many reasons, including expediency. But in Asia, the mark of a true friend is showing goodwill and not getting an advantage. Here we change friends very frequently, and we come to them for all sorts of reasons. You shake hands with somebody at a party, and now we're friends. You need something from someone. You're not doing well at math this term, and you find somebody who does, and so you make friends with that person because they'll be able to help you. But in the Asian sense, that's not what friendship is. It's something that builds up slowly over the course of time, something that you want good things for that person for their own sake, not for your own. It's not about you getting an advantage. We can see this distinction if we consider Nixon's historic trip to China back in 1972. During that trip, Nixon said that China and America were both friends now because each would get something out of the arrangement. Now, the Americans looked at that and they thought, well, that's great. But the Chinese were actually offended by that statement, because that's not the mark of friendship. Friendship is not, what can I get out of it? Friendship is liking that person for their own sake. And of course, this friendship that we talk about on the personal level carries over into the business world. You know, in this country, it's said that people will change jobs on average about once every 5 years. They're always looking for something more. They're looking for something better, looking for some improvement. But in Asia, particularly in China or Japan, the first job you get is probably the one you're going to retire from, because you build up that familiarity, right? Filial piety and brotherly respect are the root of humanity. You become part of that social matrix, and you see each other as working for the interests of each other. And that brings us to the final article I want to look at today from Iwotaka. Iwotaka writes the article, Business Ethics, a Japanese View. And he turns to the concept of work ethics. Taka says that in Japan, the first thing that everybody understands is the value that's placed upon work. Work, he says, is understood to be a self-expression of the great life force. A person reveals themselves in their work and takes great pride in their efforts. The relationships that we make with our employers, they're taken very seriously. So when a person remains at their job, they're always trying to improve it. Right? Work is the great expression of our life force. Work is tied up with who we are. And so within Asia, and particularly within Japan, that relationship that I mentioned, that friendship, that bond, it's taken very seriously. You are seen as part of the company, which is part of the family. You are looking out for each other's interests. You're looking out for each other's well-being. And you're always trying to make improvements, to make things better. And so there's a term here that is used in Japan, and this is Kaizen. Kaizen is the continuous improvement of products, of ways to work, and of the decision-making process. So employees in Japan, they see the company as existing for them. The company is also, the heads of the company also see the company as existing for the employees in the sense of this family, and so everyone wants to pull together. There is a greater sense of equality. There's a strong lack of discrimination within this. And so you're always thinking, what can we do to make things better? Not just in terms of your own unique department, but within terms of the company as a whole. You might also find that, you know, for example, everything in this in our country is very departmentalized. A CEO of a company walking down through the corridor might find a little bit of rubbish laying on the ground. They're not going to pick it up. They're going to call for the janitor because that's their job. But the CEO in Japan is going to bend over and pick it up and put it in the bin themselves. It's not beneath them. It's not below them to do that. So you're always working to make things better, and you're working together. In fact, in Japan, because of that bond, when companies begin to fail, when there are problems within the company, then we have to do something. What happens here? Well, we lay off third shift. We close down a plant. We put people to work. One of the first things we do is layoffs. But in Japan, that's the very last thing that's going to happen. It's not unheard of that the CEO, the upper management of a company, could take pay cuts. There were a couple instances where a CEO would choose to go without pay himself, simply to make sure that his employees could stay on the job and thereby continue to have meaning and value within their life. Part of this is also an idea called cross-sharing. Within Japanese companies, cross-sharing means that the controlling interest of the company, even though the company is on the stock market, you can buy shares into it and so on, the controlling interest always remains in the hands of the employees, divvied out based upon seniority and things of that nature. So there's a lot to be said for that. But there are also some negatives with regards to this as well. And one, it's a pretty major one. There's another term in Japan called Karoshi. Karoshi is death caused by overwork. Not a problem I think we would find in this country for the most part, but because of how important work is within the Japanese sensibilities, there are people who, they'll go to work, they'll do their shift, they'll stay over 2-3 hours overtime every night, not because they're forced to, but because they choose to, because they want to put more into it. They want to do more for their company. But then they'll come home and they'll spend the evening with work they've brought home with them. And they'll sit up at night thinking of new ideas and new thoughts. And the point is that after a while of living like that, without knowing how to shut down, without knowing how to take it easy once in a while, the person ultimately ends up just burning out. And they don't succeed in the things that matter. They don't succeed in life itself. And so this is not an everyday occurrence, but it does happen enough that there is this special term for it. Again, karoshi, death caused by overwork. Now, I'm not saying that the Japanese system is better. I'm not saying that it's worse, but it is different. And I think that there are things that people could learn from both sides of that issue. But where does this bring us? Well, it brings us right back to the question that I raised at the beginning of this lecture. There do seem to be differences between cultures. And so the question remains, when in Rome should you do as the Romans do? And that answer, as always, remains yours to decide.